Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. If you really want to understand how fringe economic ideas can quietly, almost stealthily, become mainstream legislation, well, you have to look at the ground game. So today, we're doing a deeply structured, completely impartial analysis of a very specific political worldview. We are unpacking the grassroots strategy and the core ideology of a group called the Promethean Pack. And the fascinating part? We're basing this entirely on a transcript from their very own internal organizing briefing. We're going to look at exactly how they view the world, the specific hard data they use to back it up, and how they physically take those ideas straight to the halls of power in DC.
To do that, we've broken things down into 4 key areas today. First, we'll look at the Promethean worldview. Second, how they define the American system. Third, the economic evidence they champion. And fourth, their actual grassroots strategy in Congress. Let's get right to it. Section 1. The Promethean worldview, the ideological battle lines. So, to really understand this group, you have to look at a specific anecdote they shared about a recently revived aerospace factory in Michigan. To them, building actual physical parts for rockets, that represents the future. They aggressively contrast this highly productive vision with what they kind of disdainfully call the old order of perpetual wars and green environmentalism.
Which brings us to Section 2, defining the American system, manufacturing versus globalism. Now, what's really interesting here is how the pack categorizes the entire political and economic world. They basically split it into 2 entirely distinct warring camps, and this philosophical framework literally guides every single action they take.
They define these 2 camps as the American system on one side and the British or imperial system on the other. In their view, the American system focuses purely on productive, physical infrastructure. We're talking space exploration, absolute national economic security, and the original principles set forth by Alexander Hamilton. Conversely, they cast the British system as an empire built on free trade, globalism, monetary perception, and NATO. To the Promethean Pack, these 2 systems are absolutely fundamentally incompatible. You literally can't have both.
To really grasp this worldview, we have to talk about a phrase they use constantly: physical economy. The Promethean Pack genuinely believes that money, stock markets, monetary policy, it's all basically just an illusion. To them, the only true measure of an economy's success is tangible industrial production. Remember that Michigan aerospace factory we just talked about? Those physical Starship parts, the massive machine tools cutting metal, the actual construction of energy infrastructure, that, they argue, is the only real economy.
Let's move to how this builds, because this ideology creates a highly specific historical lineage. The organizers don't just view the American system as some modern political talking point, right? They trace it directly through history. It's like a giant puzzle to them. They draw a straight line from Alexander Hamilton's founding economic principles, right through Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley, directly into Franklin D. Roosevelt's handling of the Great Depression, then over to John F. Kennedy's space ambitions, and finally landing on Donald Trump today. In fact, they explicitly connect FDR's mobilization of physical industry to what they call Trump's current Republican New Deal agenda.
Moving on to Section 3, the economic evidence, or what we can call the PAC's report card. Because when this group actually sits down to speak with lawmakers, they don't just bring ideas, they bring specific quantitative data to validate their worldview.
For instance, the briefing heavily emphasizes the year 1969. They point out that recent initial jobless claims are the lowest they've been since that exact year. But why 1969? Well, because they view it as the ultimate turning point. It's the year the Apollo program began winding down, and America started its headlong dive into what they call the horrors of a post-industrial society. Reversing back to 1969 levels of employment is, in their eyes, definitive proof that a physical economic revival is actually working.
They break down these stats even further for the politicians. Their key production indicators show durable goods orders up by over 8%, and manufacturing construction starts, meaning real factories, not just new shopping centers, up by 20%. Crucially, though, machine tool orders are up by 22%. They refer to machine tools as the beating heart of industry. I mean, it makes sense, right? Without machine tools, you simply can't build the machines that build the products.
So a really crucial point for them is a 69% increase in power plant construction in just a single year. That's a massive jump. They contextualize this by pointing to the use of the Defense Production Act, which is a federal law that allows the government to legally expedite industrial production to accelerate building energy facilities. They're incredibly focused on a nuclear renaissance. They actually highlight these new plug-and-play nuclear micro-reactors that can literally be loaded onto cargo planes and flown directly to Air Force bases. To the PAC, energy production isn't just important, it is the absolute backbone of the American system.
Other metrics rounding out the report card include tracking the EU trade deficit, which they note dropped by 40%. They also highlight a Goods and Construction Purchasing Managers Index sitting at 52.3, which indicates actual, real-world expansion in manufacturing. Oh, and cutting tools are up 11% too. Interestingly, they also champion the recent 25% tariff on EU trucks and cars. Now, they openly acknowledge that tariffs create uncertainty for businesses in the short term, but they argue this friction is a necessary, painful recalibration to basically force the economy back to domestic physical production. Which brings us to our final act, Section 4, Grassroots Strategy, taking the American system to D.C. So how exactly does this pack turn a pretty dense historical ideology and a bunch of data into a physical ground game in Washington? Well, they call it their Capitol Hill deployment. Over May Day, they brought in 7 seasoned organizers and 8 volunteers from across 7 or 8 different states. The sheer scale of their lobbying effort here is just remarkable. They visited or dropped into every single Republican office in the House and Senate, and nearly every Democrat office too. They only fell short by about 20 offices simply because they ran out of time. Interestingly, they noted a totally counterintuitive tactic. They deliberately wore MAGA hats even when walking into Democrat offices. Their goal wasn't to antagonize them, but actually to signal an attempt to reach across the aisle and demand bipartisan alliances on things like physical infrastructure and space superiority. And this brilliantly illustrates their exact step-by-step psychological and educational tactics. Once inside the door, they specifically target young congressional aides. We're talking interns in their 20s and older aides in their 30s or 40s who often hold degrees in economics or political science. They open by testing them, basically asking if they've ever heard of the American system, just to see if their historical knowledge goes back to Alexander Hamilton. Then they distribute highly targeted PAC literature. And if they manage to get a sit-down meeting, they literally pull out their phones or laptops and play 3 to 4 minute Promethean YouTube videos right there in the office to visually drive the message home. Let's unpack the specific pamphlets they're actually handing out to these aides. The first, American System 2.0, introduces the economic methods of Lyndon LaRouche, who's a controversial fringe political figure. They claim older politicians will remember. Then there's one called The American System is Back, Bye-Bye Globalism. This acts as their sort of printed report card, quoting 19th century economist Henry Carey and highlighting the U.S. becoming number 3 in world steel production. And then, well, there's the Police Dossier, a pretty controversial pamphlet that details the historical assassinations of U.S. presidents.
The timing of handing out this dossier is really something, because it coincided with a recent assassination attempt on Donald Trump. They use this event rhetorically in these congressional offices, drawing direct parallels to the historical murders of Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. They explicitly argue to these young aides that any leader who pushes the American system, someone who attempts to replace the globalist financial empire with a physical manufacturing-based economy, inherently threatens the global establishment and automatically becomes a target.
Which brings us to our final thought today. We've just unpacked their deeply structured historical worldview, the exact physical manufacturing data they rely on, and their highly organized ground game targeting the young minds that actually run Capitol Hill on a day-to-day basis. It really leaves us with a compelling, provocative question. If this intensive, data-driven grassroots approach continues to quietly educate and influence young aides in D.C. about the American system, well, how might it shift the underlying economic philosophies of tomorrow's legislative battles? It is a fascinating strategy, for sure, and one that certainly leaves us with a whole lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.